when you're actually trying to use ChatGPT or Claude 3.5 Sonnet, where you try to give it a task and it just gives you some random output, or it's not exactly the way you want it to be, and then you sort of like correct it, like, hey, don't do this, do that, do this, do that. In this video, we'll just discuss what is the evaluation things that we're actually using day-to-day thing, and why is it even useful? What benefit will it give us if we start using this? In the first instance, what are evals? Evaluations are basically just evaluations of how exactly the large language model is performing against a data set or your use case. So for us, mainly it will be like, what is the value that we're getting, and if the value we're getting is correct or is good, then yeah, the model is working fine. But there are so many different models out there, and each model would have their own specific fine-tunes and specific versions. We have this concept of evaluations where you have got a bunch of tests that evaluate this new model with your use case and to see how well that performs. Without this, you're basically just playing, you're just like shooting in the dark and expecting a good response. Most of the times it's fine, because when you're using ChatGPT, it really doesn't really matter. But when you're building a use case or an application, you need the responses to be exactly 100% correct. Otherwise, your customers or people using the app will be like, what the hell? What is this large language model? What is this app talking about? The evaluations are one way to actually check how well is your system performing for a specific use case using a test data set. So there are three types of evaluations. Number one is category or binary thing, where you basically just classify in a yes or a no format, or classify into a specific thing. Like, for example, is this a cat or a dog? So there's two classifications. It's binary. Either it's a cat or dog. There's nothing in between or anything like that. The second type is numerical, because generally, well, as the name says, it's just working with numbers, but generally it's not recommended to use this because large language models have a tendency to hallucinate, and they're not really generally good with numbers. And the third type is multi-outputs, where it's like multiple evaluations in just a single prompt, which is also not recommended. So the best one is the binary one, because it's a yes or no. And the reason is that, number one, it's easier to test, it's easier to quantify, and number three is that it gives a very structured output that is easy to monitor at scale. So it sounds really all scary. How do you even get started with using evaluations? Well, it's actually quite simple. You just define exactly what you want to measure by just clearly specifying a prompt and giving it a few examples of what is a good response, bad response, incorrect response, and which is also called one-shot learning or few-shot learning. Then you ask for the output in a very specific format. Ideally, you use XML tags, which is actually quite really good, and you benchmark these evaluations with a known data set. So you would have a data set with all the correct answers, and you use this evaluation in a model and with that data set, and you see and you try to compare the outputs from that, whether it's correct or wrong, and some things like that. So you sort of like create a benchmark from the correct responses and the bad response, and to see how effective is this model. You use the benchmark result to iterate and refine the prompt in order to get a better result for your use case. One tip is to actually use the APIs if they're available, where they specifically instruct the large language models to actually send the responses back in JSON format, which is actually quite cool, because this is exactly what we wanted to do. It sounds pretty simple to do, but what do you even do with results? Like, how do you evaluate them and how do you use them? Generally, evaluations are very stable, and they tend to perform really well than general tasks, because they're asking large language model a very specific thing. And you use this test data set that you've created to run it multiple times to ensure that the large language model is returning more or less consistent results, because you can't control 100% of what the large language model will produce. As you're trying to use these evals, you try to iterate, refine, or even just create new prompts to see how well does your model perform for your use cases with your test data set. And maybe you could try on adding in some more additional pre-processing steps. Maybe you can take the initial response and add up post-processing steps, or maybe just changing test results. Maybe you realize that this data set is not effective enough. I mean, there are just so many different things that you would do, and it just honestly, it just depends on what exactly you're trying to do. And you can play with these different parameters like testing, pre-processing, data sets, different models, maybe different fine-tuning of the models to get exactly refine and get the LLM to perform for the use case that you actually want it to perform against. One thing I would say to be very careful of is about synthetic data sets, because they are not really representative of the real world or the production use case. So the evaluations might be slightly skewed if you're using a synthetic test data set, but it just all depends on how good your test data is, how well it performs according to the use case. So Hope that was interesting. It's a very simple idea that most of us developers are not really understanding or really trying to use it, but it's something that we do anyways while using ChatGPT. And if you're building applications or even just using it for yourself, just remember to save those prompts, whatever that you're using, and constantly iterate over them and to see which one works the best. Then the next time when you come and use it, you've got the most effective prompt and you get the answer exactly that you're looking for. As always, keep on learning, and until next time.